right, guys, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about consequences of westward movement on Native Americans. Now, if you were in American 1 in the fall, then you saw this stuff in Unit 9. Unit 8, the Gilded Age unit. If you were in American 1 in the spring, then you did not see this stuff because we didn't even get there. COVID or no COVID, like we didn't make it to this part of the curriculum. So everyone probably needs a refresher. So let's hop in. This first stuff, though, is going to be kind of a recap of what was going on with Native Americans in the 19th century. So this should hopefully ring some bells, but if not, we'll go over it again. So in 1804, Jefferson bought the Louisiana Territory from France, essentially doubling the size of the United States overnight. And this is kind of where you're starting to see the idea of manifest destiny coming into play, where Americans believed it was their, destiny and their fate to move out west no matter what or who was living where originally. And so Americans decide that, okay, now that this land is technically, quote, American, it's theirs for the taking. And so they move into previously Native American lands, pushing them further west and dispersing and displacing them. This obviously makes Native Americans pretty pissed off. And so one of the contributing factors to why the War of 1812 happened was some of this resentment um, from Native Americans towards the American government and Americans because of the displacement. And so they're also getting weapons from, the British and Canada. And so you have these American troops that are like, wait, where are these Native Americans getting guns from? This is very, very odd. Anyway, it all blows up into the War of 1812, which is mostly between the US and Great Britain. However, Native Americans teamed up with Great Britain to fight against the US. Now, when the war ended with an armistice in 1814, both the US and Great Britain kind of just agreed to stop fighting. There wasn't a clear winner, but there's definitely a clear loser, and that's Native Americans because they are pushed further west because they tried to resist and fight the American government and the US Army, and they lost. They were pushed further off their lands. Okay, so then there's the Indian Removal Act in the Jackson administration, where the government forced natives in the southeastern part of the US to move to Oklahoma. Now, some Native Americans resisted kind of peacefully. We'll talk about that with the legal system in a second. And other Native Americans, like the Seminoles in Florida, fought back. So we'll look at the peaceful resistance first. So there was the Indian Removal Act. However, that's a federal law. Georgia also passed state laws requiring that Native Americans move off their land, specifically the Cherokee. And the Cherokee wanted to fight this. So eventually there was a Supreme Court case to address this, known as Worcester v. Georgia, where John Marshall said, okay, Indian Removal Act aside, we'll talk about that later, these Georgia laws are not allowed because Native Americans are essentially their own country, and Georgia can't conduct foreign policy with an independent country. That's only the job of the United States. And so essentially, this protected the Cherokee from moving. And Andrew Jackson's job as president is that he should have told Georgia, okay, Georgia, like your laws can't stand. You cannot move Native Americans off. But instead of doing that, he gave Georgia the green light to basically kick Native Americans off their land. And then any natives who didn't leave based on the Georgia laws then were forced to remove with the Indian Removal Act later on. And so this is going to lead to the Trail of Tears, specifically the one that was the route for the Cherokee to be removed from Georgia. They were treated especially harshly because they did try to resist. But like I said, there was also some violent resistance, and that was with the Seminoles, with the Seminole Wars. That's on the next slide, but just to show you, they were mostly over here in Florida, but they were eventually moved out west too. But they had been resisting for a span of like 30 or so years or 20 or so years over the series of a few different wars. In the end, though, they were forced to give up their land and they were also moved to Oklahoma away from Florida. Okay, so then they're living on those lands in Oklahoma for a few decades, and the federal government decides, you know what, we would like to sell some of this land to white farmers so we can make some money and so that, white people can have land ownership. So the government passed the Indian Appropriations Act in 1851, which basically said, all right, Native Americans living in kind of the Great Plains area, including the already, quote, Indian territory of Oklahoma, you guys have to move on to even smaller reservations now so we can sell that land to farmers. So you're starting to see, Native Americans were like, okay, you told me I had to live here, but now you're telling me I have to move again. Like you're going to sell my land again. So they're definitely distrustful and definitely resentful of the US government. Okay, so let's talk about some reactions to the reservation system in the 1850s through like 1900s. There were definitely some Native Americans that kind of resigned. They were like, you know what? Like we could fight back, but that would be more of us dying, and it would be harder for us to, carry on our culture and literally our lives if we keep fighting. And so some of them just kind of resigned to the reservation system. Um, Also, though, it was difficult to kind of continue on with their way of life as westward movement continued out west because of the destruction of the buffalo. Um, Culture. Native Americans of many tribes use buffalo extensively. Every single part of this animal, from its bones to its muscle to its hide to its poop to, I mean, like everything about the buffalo was used. And so, as it was being killed in great numbers, partly because their furs were in demand in the East, but also because white farmers knew that they could weaken Native Americans if their buffalo was taken away. So, as their resources dwindled, many Native Americans kind of resigned to the fact that they were going to be pushed onto reservations. But some Native Americans fought back. They resisted. So, one tribe specifically were the Sioux. So, we're going to talk about two separate incidences with the Sioux. The first is the Great Sioux War. So, this was in 1876 to 1877. You have the U.S. Army versus Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. And this kind of year of warfare is most known for the Battle of Little Bighorn, which is a battle where General Custer's troops, or Colonel Custer, I think he was a general in the Civil War, then after the Civil War, he was a colonel. But anyway, he was ambushed by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, and all of the Americans in that regiment were killed. Um, However, even though they won that battle, they lost this war and they were eventually forced to surrender to reservations or to try to escape to Canada, which is what actually Sitting Bull does, because he'll come back a little bit later. But some of the American soldiers who fought in the Native American wars out in the West were known as Buffalo soldiers. The idea of buffalo were in the West. But a lot of these Buffalo soldiers were Black soldiers. They were in some cases Civil War veterans fighting for the Union, but they were also Black soldiers who were trying to, make a new life for themselves, join the Army, make that a career, because it was very difficult, especially in the South, to have any type of career as a Black American after the Civil War. But the federal government specifically sent those soldiers out to the West to fight Native Americans, knowing that they would basically fight each other and kill each other. And then in the American government's eyes, it was kind of a way to get rid of two, quote, less than favorable groups of people. So pretty messed up by the American government. We're going to see those Buffalo soldiers come back in a few units where they are sent to Cuba to fight in the Spanish American War a little bit later on. So, like I said, remember, Sitting Bull escaped to Canada. A few other of the Sioux Native Americans also escaped, and they come back a little bit later in 1890, and they start hosting what are called ghost dances, which were these huge rituals, like hundreds of Native Americans big, where they would just dance for days on end, where they would collapse and literally pass out, and then have these visions of their ancestors coming back to help them fight for their land. They would wake up and they would just keep dancing. And this grew government attention and grew military attention. And Sitting Bull was arrested and killed. And then there were arrest warrants put out for any Native Americans participating in ghost dances. And so the Lakota chief, his name was Bigfoot, he realized that, okay, Sitting Bull has been killed. Like, they have no issue killing Native Americans. Like, we just need to surrender and, like, just resign to wherever they're going to put us, whatever reservation they're going to put us on. So they resigned, and they were arrested, and they were peacefully being held in a military camp until the American military fired on the already surrendered Lakota people in what's now known as the Wounded Knee Massacre. It was in the past known as the Battle of Wounded Knee. However, because the Lakota people were not fighting back, they didn't have weapons because their weapons have been confiscated from them. It's not really a battle, it is legit a massacre because 300 of these Sioux and Lakota natives were slaughtered by US troops, including Bigfoot down here, and then buried in mass graves at Wounded Knee. So let's close out the 19th century here. So for a span of, let's say, about 40-ish, 50-ish years, there were what were called Native American boarding schools that were set up in America with the idea of basically forcing Native American children to assimilate to American culture. Um, Now, like I said, this was forced assimilation. A lot of these Native American children were literally kidnapped off of these reservations. Some Native American families sent their children to these boarding schools, believing that it was the only way their children could really survive in America was to assimilate. Either way, though, children in these boarding schools were taught that Native American culture was uncivilized. They were beat for like literally beat or like withheld food and stuff like that for speaking in their native languages or practicing their native religions. So this was definitely a dark chapter in American history for sure. There was also a book that came out during this time called A Century of Dishonor. It was written by Helen Hunt Jackson, which basically looked at the last 100 years of Native American treatment by the federal government. So it came out in 1881. 100 years before that is 1781, which is right when the Constitution was being written. And so she's like, let's look at, the 100 years of our country's, you know, age and let's see how Native Americans have been treated. And she exposed that there were just broken treaties and broken promises and, massacres and relocations and all of these things that were committed by the US government against Native Americans. And then to kind of wrap up the 19th century for us, we're going to look at the Dawes Severalty Act. So the word severalty means one person owns property. And again, what the government was trying to do here was to try to like consolidate reservations and make them smaller while freeing up land to sell to white settlers or white farmers. So basically, it said, okay, on Native American reservations, each family gets 160 acres, and then any remaining land will be sold to American farmers. And these Native Americans living on these 160 acres, they have to farm it, and they have to show improvement upon this land, kind of in the same way the Homestead Act was set up. The problem, though, is that the once Native Americans were kind of put on these 160 acres of land, essentially forcing them to assimilate to American ideas of individual land ownership and farming. They weren't given any resources or any aid by the federal government. The federal government was like, you guys just do your thing, okay, bye. And Native Americans did not have the resources to set up communities in the way that the government kind of was expecting them to. And so a lot of these reservations fell into poverty, where a lot of them still exist today. So by 1890, we kind of talked about this yesterday, the American, frontier is settled. I mean, like east to west coast, there's settlement everywhere, including in the middle and the Great Plains. And the American frontier, or kind of the edge of American civilization, is declared closed. So Americans have to look other places to spread their beliefs and their influence, which is going to lead to something called imperialism, which we'll talk about in a few units. Basically, the US going into already existing countries and essentially taking them over. That's how the US got Hawaii. It's kind of what the US did with Cuba. But we'll look at a few different examples a little bit later on. But that's kind of the idea, is that America is going to expand beyond its borders to try to spread its influence and manifest destiny outside of